I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this event, and that includes the people who have made it technically possible. My name is Howie Jacobs. I'm a molecular biologist and I work in Tampere University. And I've been around in Finland now for almost 25 years. And so I think I'm well acquainted with Finland and with its punk rock culture. But I'm going to talk here about punk and my relationship with punk as a scientist in more detail. Of course, we don't have a live audience today, so it's not possible to be properly interactive, but I do hope that those of you who do have comments or questions to ask me will use the comment function on YouTube, and I will get back to you eventually. The other defect, of course, is that it's very difficult to attune a talk like this to the actual audience sitting in front of me because I can't see you and I don't know who you are. So if I'm speaking in some ways that are not appropriate to the actual audience, I won't know that until much later. So please bear with me. And I will be speaking about a number of different topics. So if I seem to veer off the topic that you're really interested in, please be patient because I'll probably come back to the ones that you are interested in at a subsequent point in my talk. So I'm a punk and a scientist. And so I felt that the most important thing that I can do here is to try to explain how these two apparently very different or disjointed aspects of my personality are somehow linked, and perhaps speak about how punk and science as more general concepts might be connected. But I am going to start with a potted autobiography. Here's my agenda for the whole talk. And I will chart out how I got interested in science and in the particular topics in science that excite me, and how I got interested and involved in punk. And that will lead me on to the more general question of trying to define what is punk. And I won't preempt that now, but I'll simply say that I'm going to try to, as best I can, to relate that to me personally. And I'll spend a few minutes on this rather thorny question of whether punk, which is after all 35 years or so old at this point, is a kind of rebellion or just another kind of conformity. And then I'll say some words about punk and science and talk a little bit about the things that connect those two aspects of me, but also more generally. And then at the end, I'll come back again to more personal issues and give you some personal reminiscences of my punk rock life. So just to start with where I've been and when in my life. I was born in London. I then moved around in the UK and then to the US and finally to Finland. And I was lucky enough during a number of these periods to be kind of at the epicenter of the punk culture of the day. So, for example, London in the late 1970s, then LA in the early 1980s, Scotland during both periods, and then the place in Finland, which just happens to be one of the major centers of punk culture, at least in Europe, namely Tampere, and I'll say some more words about that as we go on. So I was born in London in 1955, which was quite an auspicious year for rock and roll culture in general, because it was the year when Rock Around the Clock was released. And it was also the year when one of the non-musical icons of what you might call rock and roll culture, the actor James Dean, burst upon the scene. He also died in that year as a result of his Live Fast, Die Young road accident, which actually occurred before two of his three full-length feature movies were released. So somehow 1955 is a rock and roll year, even though obviously I was just a baby at the time. Just as a kind of aside here, during my youth in London, it just so happened that by coincidence, my father's optometry practice was located in the very center of what became the main cultural location of punk in the late 1970s. And he was actually right next door to Boy Boutique, which is one of London's premier punk clothing stores. And actually, when Boy opened, they gave my dad, as a gift for me, my first pair of bondage pants. So somehow I have very fond memories of that link. Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's store was just a bit further down the street. During those years, I also began my studies in biochemistry, initially in Cambridge. I'd actually been interested in molecular biology since I was quite a young teenager, and I will come back to that in a few moments. But in Cambridge, I was lucky enough to be adopted as my project supervisor by Tim Hunt, who's since become a very famous scientist in his right. And he invited me to come with him during the summer of 1977 to the United States to work on a project with him where we were studying the creature shown here. I don't know if you can see my pointer. This creature top right, one of the common sea urchins. And the project that we were engaged in was to try to understand what activates the egg of the sea urchin when it gets fertilized and starts to make all the different proteins that will allow it to develop and to become a larva and eventually an adult sea urchin. And you might also notice here that the sea urchin has a very spiky, punky style. But at that time, at least, even though I was already interested and immersed in punk rock culture, I still look more like a hippie in the photo bottom left. 1977 was also the year of the Queen's Silver Jubilee, and the Sex Pistols celebrated tribute or anti-tribute to her. Okay, after Cambridge, I moved on to Glasgow to do my PhD in a cancer research institute under the supervision of another famous scientist of the day, John Paul, together with George Burney. George and I had a very strong in day-to-day terms, strong relationship, even though he was completely different from me on a personal level. He was a very conservative Scottish gentleman, but somehow the combination of the two of us worked very well indeed. And I got a lot out of those years. Those were also years when Glasgow was one of the first cities in the UK and perhaps in the whole of Europe to self-consciously undergo its urban regeneration, clean up its buildings, and rebrand itself as a centre for the arts and culture. During those years, I also became acquainted with and became almost a kind of groupie of the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow, which was, although it's not directly connected with punk, it was at the time, and to some extent still is, pretty much the UK's most prominent avant-garde theatre. And its visual style and whole style of presentation of its theatrical pieces was very much influenced, I think, by the punk culture of the day, even though it wasn't explicitly punk. And these were also the years of prominent Scottish bands like the Rosillos, the Skids, Simple Minds, and then later the Exploited. So I had really moved on from one centre of punk rock to another. And then my next move was a little bit similar in that regard, because I went on to Los Angeles, where I studied under the supervision of this person on the left, Eric Davidson, again studying sea urchins and looking at various aspects of gene expression in embryos. But this led inadvertently to me landing on mitochondria as my main topic, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. As well as LA being the center of punk rock, I was also working for a mentor who was in some ways as eccentric or possibly more eccentric than myself, but in totally different ways. So as well as being a distinguished scientist, Eric was also the coach of an American football team. He smoked big, fat, horrible cigars. He rode a Harley, and he played banjo in a bluegrass band. And he didn't really understand where I was coming from, but nevertheless recognized that I was somehow a kindred spirit in having my own list of equivalents to all that. And again, there was a healthy mutual respect between us, and I think I got a great deal out of the interaction. LA in those years, as I've already said, was very much the new center of punk rock, with bands like Black Flag, X, 45 Grave, the Go-Go's, and many others. And it was also the years when Penelope Spheris produced the first of her classic punk movies, The Decline of Western Civilization, which was, that series was a dramatized documentary series, which was then followed up by fictional films such as Suburbia. LA was and still is also the kind of place where you could go out to a bar or a restaurant and had a very strong probability of bumping into a movie star or a rock star. And that included minor luminaries such as here, Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols. I then returned to Glasgow under the mentorship of another distinguished scientist, although at the time he was very young, not a great deal older than myself, David Sherrod, pictured on the left. And I was there able, under his guidance, to set up my own independent laboratory where I pursued my studies on mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, but of course mitochondria are now understood to do far more than just generate energy. But mitochondria from that time onwards really have become the central interest of all of my scientific work. Glasgow also hosted during those years a lot of punk rock concerts. It almost became a kind of institution over those years that were now already 10 years further on from the origin of punk rock. And I want to make a particular mention here of Stiff Little Fingers, a band from Ireland who came to play regularly in Glasgow 2 or 3 times a year during that period, and subsequently every year until the pandemic has put a stop to it, but hopefully just temporarily, on St. Patrick's Night. I'll actually come back to say some words about Stiff Little Fingers at the end in another context. From Glasgow, I moved on to Finland. I was recruited to Tampere in 1996, and throughout most of the time that I've been in Finland, my studies have been centered on the use of the fruit fly Drosophila to study aspects of mitochondrial function and dysfunction and how that relates to human disease. And we talk about Drosophila as a model organism where we can conduct experiments easily, but which then mirror things that are happening in humans and indeed in virtually all organisms that have, in this case, mitochondria and the major other features of complex cells. During my time in Glasgow, I also have got involved in many science communication activities. I have become a member of EMBO, the European Molecular Biology Organization, which is Europe's Life Sciences Academy, and I've become involved in many of their activities. This 25 years or so has also been a time when, because of the success of my scientific work here, with all the resources that Finland has been able to provide to me, I've done a lot of traveling. I've been invited to lots of international conferences, And hopefully we'll all be able to do that. I and other scientists will be able to do that again in the future, because I think it's one of the most important things in science that we're able to meet face to face and discuss the meaning of the latest findings, both from our own labs and from others. I discovered also that Tampere is a center, or perhaps the Finland's center of punk culture, which is still alive. And I'll say some further words about that at the end. But here I just want to mention that whilst I was back in the early 80s in Los Angeles, I came across a mention in one of the fanzines of the punk rock scene in LA in those days. I came across an article about a band from Finland called Chaos. And I was lucky enough in my very first week in Tampere to actually meet the members of Chaos. So somehow that was a kind of marriage of these two periods in my life. Okay, I'm now going to come on to the more general issue of what is punk. And I think immediately we're going to hit some difficulties, because although, as I've already said, punk is perhaps most obviously a style of music, it's not even clear which style of music it is. And there are lots of discussions, or endless discussions, about what punk music really is, and whether a particular song or a particular record is or is not punk. Is it too commercial? Is it too mainstream? Is it too melodic? Is it too much like incomprehensible white noise? But of course, punk is more than just music. It's all these other things that I've put on the slide. But it's quite difficult to pin down. So if, for example, I chose an adjective relating to all of these subjects, which has nothing to do with punk, it's very easy. I can just come up with a whole list. So black tie is clearly a kind of fashion, and it's very definite what it is. But when I tried, or in preparing this lecture, when I tried to come up with an equivalent list of adjectives to describe these aspects of punk, and I came up with some, but in virtually every case, one could object that what I've put down here isn't really close to the truth, or it's not complete, and there are some gaps. There are some things that I've put in here because I had to find something. And it really doesn't apparently hang together, and it doesn't cover the whole of what punk is. And when I reflected on this further, I felt that what was really missing here is what I've written at the bottom of the slide, that in the whole of punk culture, there is a very strong element of parody, and that includes self-parody. And I think that's important in trying to understand how I got interested in punk, which I'll try to explain in more detail in a few moments. Even though it's very difficult to pin down in words, when we encounter an image like this, we only really have to look. This is the poster from one of the Sex Pistols' early records, but you really only have to glance at that for a second to know that it's something to do with punk. And indeed, if you would look at all these characters, these are photographs of people that I've encountered in punk rock festivals along the way. And if you looked at each of them, you wouldn't have any difficulty in saying, yes, that person is punk or a punk. And they've got many of the hallmarks of the punk fashion, the punk style, the punk attitude, and so on, even if there are some borrowings from other styles, such as this person top right, who is a male, but he's wearing a woman's bra, or this person on the top left, who is wearing an industrial high-vis vest. But nevertheless, that doesn't detract from the fact that they're all clearly punk. On the other hand, if I took this cast of characters, who I've photographed at exactly the same punk rock festivals and events, none of them really stands out as obviously punk. If you met any of these people in the street, you might say, oh, that's a person in an elephant costume, or that's a person wearing pink combat trousers, but you wouldn't say, aha, that's a punk. But all of these people would define themselves as punk, And they are at a punk festival to celebrate the fact that they have that in common with each other and with me and with all the other people present in the audience at that event. So I think we've got to try to go beyond all those adjectives to look at a deeper level at what the feeling, what the, I'm struggling to find a noun to describe what I'm talking about here, but to try to find what is the essence of punk. And one of those that I stumbled into, which I think is really important, or at least it sums up for me what punk is all about, is a line coming from a classic punk movie, Lech Kowalski's DOA, A Rite of Passage, which was shot mainly in the late 70s and the very early 80s. And it's a line that's spoken by Terry Sylvester, who is the front man of a rather obscure punk band called Terry and the Idiots. And Terry says that punks have the courage to walk down the street looking totally ridiculous. And that really struck a chord with me. And that sums up for me in many ways what punk is and why and how I became a punk. And it goes back to what I've scribbled at the bottom of the slide here, that during my own early life, I suppose I was a very serious, studious teenager, and everybody took me very, very seriously. And I actually found that was a barrier separating me from other people as I was growing up. On the one hand, they dismissed all the superficial things that I might have to say because I was labeled as a serious person. And perhaps even worse, when I did want to say something serious, a lot of people thought, oh, well, that's just Howie being very cerebral, and we won't understand what he's talking about, and it's all about science, so we can just gloss over it and get on to something else. And so my primary interest in being serious and a person aiming to become a scientist was something that cut me off from other people. And so although I think it wasn't a completely conscious process, but looking back, I don't think you need to be a psychoanalyst to see that I then was very attracted to punk because it now allowed me to adopt a consciously silly image which counterbalanced that studious aspect so that I could then just be a lot more able to interact naturally with other people, because people were never quite sure if I was being serious or silly. So people stopped taking me too seriously, but nevertheless paid attention to some of the serious things that I did have to say. So is punk a form of rebellion or a form of conformity? Rebellion is very much on the top of the list of things that you would say that teenagers in the late 1970s were trying to express through punk culture. And even to this day, it remains the name of the world's biggest punk rock festival, which is held every year, at least pre-pandemic times, in Blackpool in England. But at the same time, the punk image of leather jackets and spiky hair and studs and so on is also a kind of uniform or an identity for misfits that's become a little bit fossilized. So that if we go back a few slides, I won't actually go back in the slideshow, but if we just go back to my slide where I was showing all those people that didn't obviously look like punks, well, those people consider themselves punks, but the other ones that are dressed in spikes and studs and colored hair and so on, left with the fact that punk is both rebellion and conformity, and I don't really want to try to separate those any further. Let's come on to punk and science, because although my own reasons, whether conscious or subconscious, for adopting punk weren't really directly connected with science, although they were indirectly connected with science because they were driven by my interest in serious science as a topic and as a career choice. Nevertheless, it became obvious to me as the years went by that there were lots of really important connections between punk philosophy and punk style and punk attitude and science, especially the kind of science that I felt, or the way of doing science that I felt and still feel is really important. Although many people learn science in school by simply absorbing or being taught a set of facts, the reality of science is that it's just a view of the universe, or the best view of the universe that we have at this time. And the process of science isn't that static picture, but it's all the experimental work that we are constantly doing to test the ideas that have come out of that apparently factual body of knowledge, and see if they're still supported by evidence, and if they're not, we then have to reframe our hypotheses and test the new ideas. So a fundamental part of doing science is to challenge received ideas. And in particular, those ideas that have been handed down to us for years, for generations, or perhaps in some cases even for centuries, and which we all assume to be true, but then really not based on any evidence at all. They're just convenient things or convenient assumptions that we make that make us feel comfortable, but nevertheless, they may not be valid. And that's very close to a dictionary definition of bullshit. So I would say here that it's really important that as a scientist, or scientists in general, we need to look where our ideas are coming from. And if they're coming just as hand-me-downs in that way, we should reject them, or at least challenge them with new experiments. Another fundamental aspect of punk, which I think relates to science, is in the third bullet point here: keep it simple. So punk rock music, in all of its different manifestations, is basically very straightforward. It's the 3-chord punk band from 1977, or variations on that theme. And whilst there is some interest, I think, in much more complex pieces of music, especially that can be related to emotionally and studied intellectually or even mathematically, nevertheless, in terms of gripping the immediate attention of the audience, punk rock scores over those more complex forms of music. But also in science, simple ideas, which together make up a complex whole, but simple ideas are what lead us, I think, to an understanding of the universe. And when I read a scientific paper, if I get to the third page and it's got tangled up in huge knots that don't seem to have anything to do with the concept that was first presented, then I lose interest in the work because of that fact that it's too complex and it's constructed around too complex a set of ideas and assumptions. And I think the best science is simple science, especially science that's conducted with very simple tools. Something else that's very important, it really relates back to the first of these bullet points, is that I think a good scientist is not afraid to get it wrong. So we shouldn't just be challenging the ideas that we've received from other scientists from previous generations and so on, but also the ideas that we've elaborated ourselves based upon our own experiments, which might also be wrong. It seemed a very good idea at the time, but when we did a subsequent experiment, it contradicted the assumptions that we'd made on the basis of the first. And I think I do meet in science a lot of people that are really still very afraid to admit that they got it wrong. And I think that's really a fundamental aspect of doing good science, not to be afraid to get it wrong. And even to make science fun, not take it too seriously. Be prepared to make a bit of fun of yourself and of your colleagues and your own ideas and their ideas too, so that it becomes a more kind of human-friendly discourse rather than something that's very abstract and intellectual and cold. So in the world of punk, or I would say in the world of scientists, in the world of science, as a punk, I'm not alone. And I've put here a few examples which I'll go through quite briefly. The thing I should say here is that I do not play and never have played a musical instrument, not even in one of those 1977 bands that proudly announced that they couldn't even play their instruments, and it was true. I never even did that. But, and here I'm giving some examples of people who are scientists, but who have actually played punk rock in various different contexts. But I think this is just the tip of an iceberg. There are many people in science who are still interested in, who listen to punk music, who maybe even dress as punks. And so it's really not the case that I'm unique, even though to a non-scientific audience, perhaps even to a non-scientific punk audience, this connection is not obvious. So I'd like to almost pay tribute to some of the characters mentioned on this slide. So perhaps the first, I hope you'll forgive me for drawing attention to this, almost the first that I would like to mention it is in fact from Finland. Seppo Vainio is today the professor of developmental biology in the University of Oulu. But as well as being a distinguished scientist, he was also somebody who played on the very first punk rock single to be released in Finland in the late 1970s in a band called Briard, which also, so Seppo played drums under a pseudonym. Also in that band was somebody who became much more famous later on as a rock star, namely Andy Mccoy. Seppo actually went on, after having done his PhD in Helsinki, but before he went to Oulu to take up his current position, he actually worked with a colleague of mine in the United States, who I worked with in Caltech in the early 1980s, and who is very much one of those people that I would put in that bracket of people who listen to and like punk rock music, but you wouldn't identify them walking down the street as a punk. Anyhow, let's go on. Mira Arroyo is a scientist from Oxford. She went to Oxford to study under the supervision of somebody I've already mentioned, David Sherratt, who was my mentor when I went back to Glasgow as an independent fellow. And Mira did some very important work that was published in highly prestigious journals, explaining the mechanisms by which chromosomes separate, daughter chromosomes separate from each other in the process of cell division. And her model system in this case was not the fruit fly Drosophila, but it was the model bacterium that we all have worked on at some point or other in our career, namely E. coli. So she worked on chromosome segregation in E. coli towards her doctorate, but then she actually made a decision to leave science altogether and focus full-time on her musical career in a new wave or post-punk band called Ladytron. Down the right-hand side of this slide, I have mentioned some members of leading or very well-known punk rock bands in the United States who are also scientists. And perhaps you've heard of some of these bands or some of these individuals, but you've probably not read their scientific papers or understood what their contributions to science have been. So I'm going to say a few words about that before I go on. So Greg Graffin is the lead man of the band Bad Religion, but he's also an evolutionary biologist and a philosopher of science who did his PhD in Cornell in the early 2000s, and he's lectured quite widely on these topics in various universities in the US. Mila Åkerman is the front man of another punk rock band called The Descendants. He's a plant biologist who did his PhD in San Diego in the 1990s, and then went on to, as well as developing his musical career for a long time, he then worked professionally as a scientist, both in academia and in various companies, and also published some very important papers trying to account for the regulation of the genes that specified the various different tissues and physiological processes that go on in plants. Brian Dexter Holland, who is well known as the leading guy from the band The Offspring, is also a scientist. He is a molecular virologist who completed his PhD perhaps over a rather longer period of time than would be normal, because he was also pursuing his punk rock career at the same time. So he graduated with his doctorate from the University of Southern California back in 2017. And he works on the ways in which viruses mimic and exploit some of the informational process of cells, actually hijack those processes so that they can then propagate themselves and ensure their own survival over long periods of time. He's done some, I think, really quite important work on how those processes operate in the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. But I think since we're getting towards the end of my talk, I want to come back and focus on punk music, which I think is, after all, what holds the whole field of punk together. And so in preparing this talk, I decided that at the end I would focus on my own most memorable punk rock moments. And I had the idea that I would be able to boil these down to just 2 or 3 occasions that I would then talk about to you in detail. But I found this an incredibly difficult task. And so I came up with a list initially of tens, maybe almost approaching 100 different events that I wanted to mention. Obviously, I don't have time to do that. And so I have reduced it a little bit to this slide and this slide, but there's still well over a dozen occasions that I could point to and said that was a crucial punk rock event in my life and in my memory, and has importance not only because of the artist or what they represented, but also in many cases because of the people I was with at that time or knew at that time, or who had introduced me to that particular artist or musical act. But I will go through some of these in a little bit more detail. Those of you who watch this presentation on YouTube probably have enough information here that you can go back and find out a little bit more detail on what these events all were. You can start with Google, and in a number of cases you'll find some video records of these events, some bootleg recordings, and you might, if you are lucky, you might even glimpse me occasionally in the crowd or in a very tiny image on a graphic. So, but I was just a member of the crowd in all of these occasions. I think if I had to single out one particular artist or band, it would be The Clash. And I've put here on the slide 5 of the 6 or so occasions that I actually saw them play. I really couldn't choose which between them was the most inspiring. And I've also included here a couple of occasions where Joe Strummer played after the Clash had disbanded as such, but Joe Strummer continued to play music with other bands and appeared on stage sometimes with bands totally unexpectedly, like when he appeared with the Pogues in the Barrowland concert venue in Glasgow in 1987, together with Kirsty McCoy. And in addition to The Clash, I'd also mention here the Adverts, so I was actually present at the chaotic last show of the Adverts in the 1970s when they played at one of the student unions in Glasgow, where I had gone to study for my own PhD. And then by coincidence, I was also able to be present more than 20 years later at their miraculous reincarnation, or at least the reincarnation of their lead singer, T.B. Smith, who now assembled a new band with himself and the Finnish band Punk Lyrics OK to play advert songs, but in Tampere at the beginning of the next century. So kind of I was by accident bracketing these two events, the end and the rebirth of the adverts. Concerts and events that I was at include all these occasions, mainly in the United States, but also American bands playing in Europe. The one that I'd like to focus on here is the Vandals. And I'm going to say a little bit more in a moment about the particular concert that I'm drawing attention to here, which was a live performance on a radio station, KPFK Studio Z, or Z as I would say in British English, in 1983. That leads me to the next slide. So I loved the Vandals at that time, and this particular concert was kind of archetypal because it was a very fine performance of their raw style of punk rock at the time, with intense, visceral lyrics that parodied and also criticized some of, or many aspects of American society of the day, including the liberal Hollywood elite. But their band was their music was a parody of the Hollywood elite, but it was also a parody of their own parody. And it was a parody of their fans' behavior, which then became music or art imitating life, or life imitating art, because the major thing that happened on that occasion was that their fans, instead of just jumping around and listening to the music and watching the band play, I have to say that I was just an onlooker in these events, but their hardcore fans decided that it would be fun to smash up the studio of the radio station where they were playing and turn all the furniture in that studio into firewood. And that occasion is apparently still talked about almost 30 years later by the staff of KPFK, because it marked the point after which that radio station, and I believe none of the radio stations in Southern California ever had a live punk rock show again. So it was kind of, obviously the fans of the Vandals were oblivious to the fact that they were being made fun of by the band, and then did the thing that they were being made fun of by acting as Vandals. And we can see echoes of that even today in events in the United States, where people kind of misunderstand what's being said to them. Perhaps what's being said to them might have willfully engendered this kind of misunderstanding, but where people take that is this little fingers that I've already mentioned in regard to their now annual concerts in Glasgow on St. Patrick Night, and I've been lucky enough to attend a number of those over the years. Stiff Little Fingers also have very ironic and cutting lyrics, but almost entirely from the very beginning in the 70s, those lyrics were directed at expressing the frustrations of young persons in Northern Ireland trapped in the cycle of violence between the two communities there. And although it's very difficult, if not impossible, to measure the effects of on that generation of hearing these lyrics and following this band and others that came after them in their wake, that expressed very much what young people felt about the tribal loyalties that they'd inherited from their parents, but that they were being then channeled into hating the other community and then committing acts of violence against them. So in this case, the youthful rebellion that Stiff Little Fingers were encouraging was a rebellion against the violence that they'd inherited and hatred that they've inherited from previous generations. I think, as I said, it's very difficult to measure how influential that message was, but I'd like to believe that it was quite influential in steering that generation towards the idea that the conflict between the communities based upon this long historical cleavage between two religious communities of different national identity was actually pointless, and that the communities were perfectly able to coexist and to recognize the validity of each other's cultural history, which then culminated finally in a real political change that occurred at the end of the 1990s in the Good Friday Agreement, where the leaders of the two communities finally agreed to lay down their arms and share power and consciously recognize the validity of each other's cultures. I think, interestingly, even though I think Stiff Little Fingers may have had some part in shaping that process, from quite an early stage, they were quite vicious in the way that they criticized the political leaders of both communities, who then were the ones who came together eventually, who shook hands and smiled sweetly to each other, as you can see in this photo, and who then happily agreed to share power, even though each side had blood on their hands. And somehow, once they became buddies in power, they never really acknowledged their own role in the violence or even the role of their partners. And they just kind of brushed it aside. You might say, well, that's necessary in making peace. But SLF, nevertheless, were very critical of the hypocrisy implicit in that process. And I've written in the slide some of their key lyrics which relate to that. Obviously, you can go and find their music and their lyrics widely on the internet. But anyway, I think I'd like to just say here that I feel still, even though I'm not from Ireland, although I've lived in Scotland, where there are strong echoes of this cultural, social divide from Ireland, present also in Scotland, and that's one of the reasons why SLF play in Glasgow on St. Patrick's Night every year. I salute the message that they have propagated down the years, and I have to say that it's very difficult for me to attend one of their concerts and not feel on multiple occasions that I'm about to shed a tear. Another memorable punk rock moment goes back to the late 80s and also has a Finnish dimension. Actually, one of the things I didn't mention earlier on when I was talking about my own autobiography was that when I was in Cambridge on my undergraduate project working for Tim Hunt, I spent long evenings in the lab listening to John Peel's radio show late in the evening, playing punk music at top volume in the lab, and that was shared, or that interest was shared by other people in the lab at that time, so it didn't seem to disturb anybody. I think nowadays, if I heard my own students playing music of any kind very loud, I would probably think they were distracting other people and suggest that they wear earphones. But anyway, I continued over the years to listen to John Peel's program, and in 1988, he played sort of the seminal single from a band called JMKE from Estonia. Their records were actually produced and released something that kind of brought home to me immediately that something was afoot in the Soviet Union, that things were about to change. Somehow listening to this record on the radio it's almost a stronger memory for me than those images of the Berlin Wall being hacked down in a year or so later, that everybody recalls or thinks of as the iconic moment when the Cold War ended. For me, somehow looking forward to the process that was going to lead to the end of the Cold War and that hopeful period, which perhaps sadly has not been fully exploited in practice. But anyway, the process by which the world would have a chance to come together with the imminent demise of the Soviet Union was brought home to me in that moment, not in that later event of the fall of the wall. Punk rock is largely considered to be a white man's music, but that's only, well, I think first of all, we all need to recognize that rock and roll really has its own roots in American black culture. But I think it's also not completely true that punk is purely a male music and is purely a white music. A lot of the early punk artists were female, and I think a lot of the philosophy of punk rejects sexual stereotypes. One of the early punk artists that I greatly admired, I think I only saw them perform one time at that same concert in Victoria Park in 1978 where The Clash played. But I'm referring to the band X-Ray Specs, and in particular their founder and lead singer, Polly Styrene, pictured here. So she also has roots in Ireland and Scotland, but in addition, in Somalia. So she comes from what one might call an immigrant background and is clearly a non-white person and was one of the stars of punk rock. And one other reason why I was drawn to her music, as well as this, was the fact that she sung about many contemporary themes, but also about science. And one of her most famous lyrics is here on the slide, a very blunt and simple warning to us biologists to be careful about what we do in making genetic changes to perhaps to humans and even to other organisms that might get out into the environment, that we need to pay serious attention always to making sure that we don't interfere with nature to the point that we will actually do damage. It's a very simple, almost a cliched message, but I think it's something that's really important, and she brought it to life in her music. So I'm going to end here with my summary slide, and I hope I'm not sure I've convinced you, but I hope I've opened your eyes to the fact that punk isn't a one-dimensional concept any more than I'm a one-dimensional person. And I've also given you at least some inklings of why the underlying philosophy of punk and of science are very similar, and they somehow meet in me. And above all, they're both fun. And I think that's really important. You know, we're only on this planet for 70, 80, 90 years, however long we're individually going to live. And there's no point in wasting time doing things that we don't enjoy, that we can't then use to contribute and express our joy to others. And my enjoyment of punk and of science are both clearly in that category. Thank you. So thank you all for listening to me. At this point in a live lecture, I would, of course, invite comments or questions through the chair. And so once again, I'd like to reiterate the fact that you can still participate in a dialogue by using the comment function of YouTube. And I will try to get back to you on any point, whether it's general or trivial or critical. So please don't hesitate to make such comments. Thank you.